When the first message arrived, I thought it was just a joke, but when the thing written in the third message happened, I realized that these messages weren't telling me things that would happen in the future. They were telling me things I would do. My name is Marcus. I'm 26 years old, and I remember the day I made the biggest mistake of my life because I didn't take a message I received seriously that day. And that message was describing someone's death, or rather, it was saying that I would kill someone, but I rejected it at that moment because a person cannot accept such a thing about themselves. So I deleted the message, turned off the phone, and went on with my life until the same message came again. When the message first arrived, it was 02:41 a.m. My sleep was interrupted because my phone had vibrated, and messages coming at these hours are usually bad news. So I instinctively picked up the phone, but what I saw on the screen wasn't a name. It wasn't even a number. It just said unknown. And even that detail was strange enough, but what was truly strange was the content of the message, because there was only one sentence. Not open the door tomorrow. That was it, nothing else. No explanation, no name, no other detail. I stared at the screen for a while because I was trying to figure out what this message meant, but I couldn't make any sense of it. So I thought to myself, wrong number, and put the phone aside, but that sentence was planted in my mind. Not open the door tomorrow. This sentence was simple but effective because the human mind loves to fill in the blanks, and I had unknowingly started filling in that gap. Why shouldn't I open it? I thought. Who would come? I thought, but there were no answers to these questions because the message did not respond. When I woke up in the morning, the first thing I did was check the phone because I was hoping what I saw at night was a dream, but it wasn't. The message was still there in the same way with the same sentence, and this situation created a slight unease within me. But I still decided not to blow it out of proportion because that was the logical thing to do. The day started normally. I made my coffee. I turned on the computer. I started working. Everything was ordinary until the door knocked. The moment the door knocked, a tension I couldn't understand the reason for arose within me because after reading that message, there was a warning constantly running in the back of my mind, and this warning now felt as if it had leaked into the real world. I didn't move from my spot for a few seconds because I didn't want to open it, but at the same time, I knew this could just be a silly coincidence, and human logic always comes before fear. So I slowly stood up, walked toward the door, and with every step I took, my unease increased a bit more because that sentence was still in my head. Do not open the door tomorrow, and today was tomorrow. I approached the door, looked through the peephole, but there was no one outside. The hallway was empty. This situation relieved me for a moment because I thought if no one is there, there's no point in opening it, but then this occurred to me. If there is someone knocking on the door and I don't see them, this situation was even worse, so my hand trembled slightly as it went to the doorknob, but I opened it anyway because curiosity was now outweighing fear. When I opened the door, there truly was no one. Only a small envelope lay on the ground, white. Nothing was written on it. This sight took all the peace away from inside me because this was no longer a coincidence. This was the continuation of the message, and I was right in the middle of this continuation. I stood at the door for a few seconds, checked the surroundings, looked right, looked left, but the hallway was still empty. There was no movement, no sound. There was only that envelope, and that envelope felt like it belonged to me. I leaned down, took the envelope, weighed it in my hand because I was trying to understand what was inside. But it was light, very light, almost like it was empty, but it wasn't completely empty either. This feeling was strange because I knew there was something inside, but I had to open it to understand what it was, and at that moment, I didn't want to open it because I felt that the moment I opened it, there would be no turning back from this event. But I opened it anyway. A single piece of paper came out of the envelope. It was folded. I opened it slowly, and what I saw sat heavy in my stomach, because there was one sentence on the paper: "You opened the door." This sentence was so simple that it shouldn't have been scary, but the situation was the exact opposite because this was an observation. This was like a recording, and the worst part was this sentence was true. I had opened the door and someone knew it. I immediately looked up and stared into the hallway, but there was still no one. This situation increased my paranoia because the feeling of being watched by something invisible breaks a person's mind very quickly, and I felt myself moving toward that point. I quickly closed the door, locked it, and stepped back a few paces because I had to accept that I was now being pulled into this event. I sat at the table. I looked at the paper. I read it again. You opened the door. This sentence wasn't changing, the meaning wasn't changing, but the feeling was changing because every time I read it, it felt heavier, as if it wasn't just a sentence but a part of a process, and I had taken the first step of that process. I took my phone. I looked at the messages. That first message was still there. Not open the door tomorrow, and I had opened it. This realization confirmed that something was going wrong inside me because this was no longer a warning. It was like a test, and I had lost that test. But I didn't know what it was a test of. Nothing happened throughout that day, but even this nothing situation was disturbing because it felt like something was being prepared. Hours passed, evening came, it got dark, and I was still sitting at that table because my mind wouldn't let go of this event. I was constantly returning to the same point, the question, who did this? But there was no answer. I went to bed again at night, but sleeping was difficult because now there wasn't just a message, there was an event, and I knew this event would continue. I closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't stop. Constantly the same image, the same sentence, the same door and that envelope. Then my phone vibrated. I opened my eyes, time, 02:41. The same hour I looked at the screen, again unknown. My heart raced because I now knew what this was, or at least I could guess. I opened the message. This time the sentence was longer. Tomorrow at 18:12, do not answer the phone. I froze. Because this was no longer just an event, it contained a timing, and this timing belonged to the future. This message was telling me something that would happen in the future. But the real question was this: could I change it, or was everything already determined? From the moment I read the message, the concept of time began to change for me because now hours weren't just something that passed. They were something that approached, and specifically that hour, 18:12, was stuck in my mind. No matter what I did throughout the day, I kept returning to that moment. While drinking coffee, while looking at the computer, even while breathing, that number was in the background. And this situation breaks a person's way of thinking because you no longer live in the now. You only wait for the approaching moment, and that's exactly what I was doing, waiting. The morning started normally, but I wasn't normal because now every movement of mine was conscious. I put my phone on the table and tried not to look at it because I wanted to reduce the effect of that message, but it was impossible. My mind was constantly asking the question, what if you answer? And after a point, this question stopped being disturbing and became compelling. It is in human nature to want to do the forbidden thing, and I was feeling it. Time was moving slowly, or so it seemed to me. Every minute was heavy, every second was noticed, and this situation started to exhaust me because being constantly on alert wears a person out. I thought about turning off the phone a few times, even completely ignoring it, but that wasn't a solution either because the issue wasn't the phone. The issue was the message, and the message was now in my mind. Around 17:40, I could no longer sit still. I started walking around the room, went to the window, looked out, but the outside world was normal. People were walking, cars were passing, no one was experiencing what I was experiencing, and this feeling of loneliness made the situation even heavier because this experience was entirely special to me, something I couldn't share with anyone. 17:55. The phone was on the table. Its screen was off, but it was as if it was looking at me. 17:58. My heart started to race. My breathing changed. This wasn't just an hour anymore. It was a border, a threshold, and I had approached that threshold. 18:10. The phone vibrated. I froze because I didn't expect the message to arrive at that exact moment. I slowly approached, turned on the screen, the same again. Unknown number. I opened the message. It begins now. These 3 words created a coldness throughout my body because this was no longer a warning. It was the activation of a process. My eyes shifted to the clock. 18:11. 1 minute was left. I thought about turning off the phone, but my hand didn't move because there was a curiosity inside me. This curiosity was stronger than fear, and this was dangerous. 1812, the phone rang. There was no number on the screen, just a call. And I was watching. Time seemed to slow down because the decision I made at that moment would change everything. I didn't know what would happen if I didn't answer, and I didn't know what would happen if I did, but I had a feeling that this decision had already been made. My finger slowly approached the screen, and I accepted. I put the phone to my ear. Silence. But this silence wasn't empty. There was a very light background sound, like wind, but a wind blowing in an enclosed space. This sound was familiar, but I couldn't place it. After a few seconds, a voice came. But this voice was my voice. "You're late," it said. This sentence echoed in my brain because this wasn't just a conversation. This was an encounter. Hearing your own voice from the outside breaks a person's balance because that voice should belong to you, but it wasn't here. It was coming from somewhere else. "Who are you?" I said, but I was afraid to hear the answer to this question. "I am you," it said. This answer was so calm that it was even more frightening because it wasn't said as a threat, but as a fact, and I wanted to reject this fact, but my brain didn't allow it because the things I had experienced strengthened this possibility. "This a joke?" I said, but my voice no longer sounded convincing even to myself. "No," it said, short, clear, definite. "Then not yet," it said. This sentence caused something inside me to break because this was a beginning and I was in the middle of this beginning. My breathing quickened. I wanted to speak, but words didn't come because this event had now surpassed the limits of logic. "What will happen?" I said finally. Silence followed. A few seconds. "Then tomorrow at 21:03, do not open the door," it said, and the phone disconnected. At that moment, the phone in my hand became heavy because this was no longer just messaging. It was communication, and this communication was with the future me, or at least with something claiming to be so. But the most terrifying thing wasn't that. The most terrifying thing was the possibility of what he said coming true. I slowly sat down. I left the phone on the table. And at that moment, I realized that this was no longer under my control because I had answered the phone. Smiling skull. After the phone disconnected, the silence in the room became heavier than anything I had ever felt before because this was no longer an ordinary loneliness. This was a void between two different me's, and that void was slowly squeezing my mind. For a few minutes, I sat without moving at all because my brain was trying to make sense of what happened, but everything I thought of collapsed at some point. Logic could not carry this situation. Still, I knew one thing very clearly. Now there was a second warning, and this time it was given not just by a message, but by a voice, my voice. "Tomorrow at 21:03, do not open the door." This sentence was heavier than the first message because now I knew this wasn't a coincidence. The first time I had opened the door and the result was that envelope. In the second warning, I had answered the phone and the result was talking to myself. Now I was at the third step, and this time I wasn't supposed to open the door, but there was a very clear fear inside me because I felt that if I did the same thing again, the thing that would happen this time would be worse. I didn't sleep that night because the moment I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again, my own voice, that intonation, that calmness, and this situation destroys a person's self-confidence because you feel like you aren't even on the same side as yourself anymore. When morning came, I should have felt more tired, but on the contrary, I was strangely more awake, as if my brain was constantly in alarm mode. I couldn't do anything all day because my mind was only focused on that hour, 21:03. This number came before my eyes many times during the day. I looked at clocks, I looked at the phone, I looked at the computer, and this number was everywhere, or so I saw it. This situation was slowly distorting my perception of reality because I could no longer distinguish what was a coincidence and what was a sign. As evening approached, the tension within me increased because I didn't know what would happen this time, but I knew for certain that something would happen. Around 20:30, I sat across from the door because this time I didn't want to lose control. I wanted to be ready. I looked at the door. I looked for a long time because now that door wasn't just an exit point. It was a boundary, and I didn't know what was behind that boundary. 20:58. Time was narrowing. My heart started beating faster. My breathing became irregular, but this time I had made a decision. I would not open the door no matter what. I would not open it. 21:02. I moved closer to the door but didn't touch it because this time I had to force myself. I had to suppress the curiosity inside me because I had seen the results of my previous 2 mistakes and I might not be able to handle a third. 21:03. The door knocked. The sound was clear, it was close. And this time, it was harder. For a moment, I wanted to move reflexively, but I stopped myself because this moment was exactly the test moment. I was looking at the door, my heart was about to tear through my chest, but I didn't move from my spot. A few seconds passed, the door knocked again, harder, more impatient, and this sound was trying to break my resistance, but I stood still. I didn't open it. Minutes passed. The sound stopped. Silence returned. And at that moment, for the first time, I was relieved. Because I thought I had done the right thing this time. A small sense of victory formed inside me because I thought I might have broken the cycle. But this feeling didn't last very long. My phone vibrated. I looked slowly. New message. The same. Unknown. I opened it. You succeeded this time. This sentence relieved me for a few seconds because it was an approval. It was saying I did the right thing, but when I saw the second sentence right below it, everything inside me collapsed again. But I opened it. Froze. Because this sentence meant only one thing. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. The door was ajar. The moment I saw the door was ajar, all the balance inside me was shattered because this was impossible. I hadn't opened that door. I hadn't moved from my spot at all, and despite that, the door was open. This situation left only one possibility, and that possibility raised the fear inside me to an indescribable level. I slowly stood up. My eyes locked on the door because I didn't want to see what had entered or left through that gap. But at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from looking. I took a few steps, my heart beating faster with every step because this was now a loss of control. I had tried to prevent something, but that thing had happened outside of me. I approached the door, my hand trembling as it opened the door a bit more, and I looked into the hallway, but there was no one outside. Again, the same emptiness, the same silence, but this time that silence was different because I now knew that thing had come inside, or maybe it had never left. The moment this thought settled in my mind, I quickly backed away because now the inside of the house was not safe. Nowhere was safe. I looked at my phone. The message was still on the screen, but I opened it. This sentence was no longer just information. It was a threat because the question of who this I was didn't remain unanswered. The answer was clear but impossible to accept. He was me or something that had taken my place, and this possibility destroys the trust a person has in their own existence. And that's exactly what I was experiencing. At that moment, a sound came from behind me, very light, almost too low to be heard, but it was clear, the sound of a footstep. I froze because that sound was coming from inside the room, and I knew at that moment that I shouldn't be alone in the room. Slowly I turned my head, but I didn't turn completely because fear slows a person down. Even moving becomes difficult. I held my breath, my heart was beating in my ears, and at that moment, the second footstep came. Now I was sure I was not alone. I slowly turned, and I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the room. He wasn't moving, but he was looking at me. His face was in the shadows, but his features were familiar because that face was my face. Only one thing was missing: expression. The eyes were empty, as if there was nothing inside, just like a shell. And this image triggered the deepest fear within me because this wasn't just a copy. This was something prepared to take my place. "What are you?" I said, but my voice was trembling because I didn't want to hear the answer. That thing remained motionless for a few seconds, then very slowly tilted its head to the side. And this movement was so natural that it was even more terrifying because this wasn't an imitation. It was like a learned behavior. Then it spoke, but its lips barely moved. The voice was directly inside my head. "You already know." This sentence echoed in my brain because this wasn't an explanation, it was a confirmation. And at that moment, the last of the resistance inside me broke because I could no longer deny this. This thing was me, but at the same time it wasn't. I took a step back. but he did not approach. He just stood there, watching. This situation was even worse because something that doesn't attack is more dangerous, because its goal isn't to attack, its goal is to wait, and I began to understand what it was waiting for. "What do you want?" I said. The answer came instantly, "Your place." With this sentence, the air in the room changed because this was now an open intention, a goal, and that goal was me. The panic inside me reached its peak because this wasn't an escape situation. This was a process of exchange, and I was in the middle of this process. That thing took a step. But this wasn't a normal step because the distance hardly changed, but he felt closer. This was not a physical movement, but a perceptual one, and this made the situation even more terrifying because escape was no longer a solution. "Stop!" I shouted, but my voice was weak because control was no longer mine. That thing didn't stop. It slowly raised its hand and touched its own face. Then it waited for me to make the same movement. And at that moment, I realized the most terrifying thing. My hand started moving on its own. My hand, having completely escaped my control, remained suspended in the air. The tips of my fingers began to burn as if someone were pulling at my nerves from beneath my skin. The me before my eyes slowly pressed his finger against his cheekbone, and I felt the pain. But that pain wasn't on my face. It exploded directly within my soul. I was trapped in my own body. I could see, I could hear, but I could not command. I brought my hand to my face when my trembling fingers touched my cheek. I saw a glint in the shadow's eyes for the first time. Satisfaction. ***, let me go," I whispered, but my lips didn't move. The voice only echoed in the dark corridors of my own mind. That thing took another step. Now only a breath's distance remained between us. I could smell my own scent, my own perfume, but combined with a lingering scent of decay. When I looked into his empty eyes, I saw my own memories there. My childhood, my mother's voice, my first fears. He was pulling them away from me one by one. As I was being emptied, he was being filled. Then that ominous voice appeared in my head again. ***, time is up, Marcus. You wrote the messages, but I was the one reading them. Now it is my turn. I will be the one who writes and the one who lives. ***. Suddenly, the room began to darken. The lights didn't go out. The world erased itself. Only he and I remained. He placed his hand on my chest. My heart changed its rhythm under his hand, beginning to match his slow and cold tempo. My breath caught. My lungs felt as if they were filling with ice. I closed my eyes. As I surrendered myself to the darkness, the last thing I felt was a heavy silence followed by that shrill vibration sound. I opened my eyes. I was in bed. Sunlight was seeping through the curtains. I was drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. It was a dream, I said to myself. Just a very realistic nightmare. I sat up, took a deep breath, and reached for my phone on the table. Everything looked normal. But when I picked up the phone, I noticed the screen was on. What was open was a notes page, and only one line was written on it. "Marcus is awake. Proceed to the second stage of the plan." In that moment, I realized. My hand was trembling, but not from fear. This trembling was the lack of coordination one feels when trying to use a stranger's hand for the first time. I didn't dare look in the mirror, because now even I didn't know who was on the inside and who was on the outside. My phone vibrated again. A new message. Unknown number. I opened the message. "Now look in the mirror and smile. Your new life begins." I slowly stood up. I walked toward the bathroom. When I stood before the mirror, the face I saw was mine. But the corners of my lips slowly curled upward without me wanting them to. When I saw that emptiness in my eyes, I was finally certain. Marcus was gone. All that remained was a message.